So he was conscious on the way to the hospital?
He was conscious on the way to the hospital, he was conscious in the ambulance, he was conscious after they did the surgery.
Suge Knight is rotting inside a prison cell, legally blind, physically broken, and fighting for his life. Once the most feared man in hip-hop, the king of the West Coast now exists in silence and darkness. But that silence is finally breaking. As he listens from behind concrete walls and steel bars, Suge Knight is watching his longtime rival, Sean Diddy Combs, face federal indictments and growing legal pressure. And for the first time in decades, Suge is no longer holding back. From FBI informants and corrupt law enforcement to the truth behind the murder of the Notorious B.I.G., Suge Knight claims he is ready to expose the secrets that defined the bloodiest era in hip-hop history. Marion Suge Knight sits inside the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, a place defined by bleach-soaked hallways, cold steel doors, and the constant weight of despair. He has been locked inside this concrete box for years, serving a 28-year sentence that many believe will end not with freedom, but with death. This is not the towering, intimidating figure the world once feared. This is not the man who dangled Vanilla Ice off a balcony or ruled Club 662 with cigars, money, and menace. The man in this cell is deteriorating, piece by piece, day by day. Suge Knight is legally blind. Years of uncontrolled diabetes have destroyed his vision. He has completely lost sight in one eye and clings to just 15% visibility in the other. His world is no longer sharp or clear. It is a blur of shadows, vague shapes, and darkness closing in. He cannot see faces. He cannot read documents. He cannot even watch television like the other inmates. His body is betraying him in ways no prison sentence ever could. Blood clots sit in his lungs, making every breath feel like a fight for survival. He has lost more than 35 pounds. His once massive, intimidating frame is shrinking, slowly withering away inside the prison infirmary. The same man who once struck fear into executives, artists, and rivals alike now struggles to stand, to breathe, to exist. Yet while his body is failing, his mind remains sharp. And while his eyes are nearly gone, his ears are wide open. Suge Knight cannot watch the news on mounted televisions. But he listens. He listens closely to every whisper from the outside world. He hears guards talking. He hears inmates passing rumors. He hears lawyers discussing headlines. And most importantly, he hears about the federal raids, the investigations, and the growing legal storm surrounding Sean Diddy Combs. To Suge, these aren't just headlines. They are confirmation. Proof that the walls of protection around powerful figures are finally cracking. For decades, Suge Knight was painted as the ultimate villain of hip-hop, the violent enforcer, the corrupt executive, the man responsible for turning rap into a battlefield. And while Suge has never denied his role in the chaos of the 1990s, he has always insisted that he was not the only one playing dirty. According to Suge, the difference was simple: he was loud about it, while others hid behind money, politics, and federal connections. As Diddy's name becomes increasingly tied to federal investigations, Suge Knight sees an opportunity he never thought would come. From inside his cell, he believes the truth can finally be told. He claims the public was fed a carefully constructed narrative about the East Coast versus West Coast war, while the real power players operated safely in the shadows. And at the center of those shadows, Suge insists, were federal informants, corrupt police officers, and industry executives protected by influence. Suge Knight has long claimed that law enforcement was never neutral during the 1990s hip-hop wars. According to him, certain officers weren't just turning a blind eye, they were actively involved. Dirty cops, paid informants, and compromised investigators allegedly shaped the outcomes of cases, buried evidence, and redirected blame. Suge believes that the murders of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. were never truly unsolved. Instead, he claims they were deliberately misdirected. From his perspective, Biggie Smalls' murder was not random retaliation or gang violence gone wrong. Suge claims it was a carefully controlled operation, allowed to happen under the protection of people who knew exactly what was coming. He has hinted for years that the same system that failed to protect Tupac also failed to investigate Biggie's death honestly. And now, as federal authorities revisit old connections, Suge believes those secrets are becoming impossible to contain. In the 1990s, Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records were presented as opposing empires. On the surface, it looked like a battle between artists, regions, and styles. But behind the scenes, Suge claims it was always about money, control, and power. Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls were the faces of the war, but they were never the architects. They were assets, brilliant, influential, and ultimately disposable. Suge Knight insists that Tupac's death in Las Vegas was not just the result of a casino fight or street retaliation. He believes it was the final consequence of a system that allowed violence to flourish, while protecting those with the most to lose. And when Biggie was killed months later in Los Angeles, Suge claims it was part of the same cycle. A silencing, not revenge. What makes Suge's perspective so disturbing is not just what he says, but when he says it. A man with nothing left to lose is often the most dangerous source of truth. Suge Knight is facing failing health, permanent imprisonment, and the reality that he may never walk free again. And in his mind, that means there is no reason left to protect anyone. From his prison cell, Suge listens as the world finally begins to question figures that were once untouchable. He hears about sealed indictments, federal subpoenas, and investigations that stretch back decades. To him, it feels like history repeating itself, except this time. The spotlight is shifting away from the man everyone blamed, and toward the men who were never supposed to be questioned. Suge Knight does not portray himself as innocent. He admits he was part of a violent era. He admits he made enemies. But he rejects the idea that he was the mastermind behind everything that went wrong. Instead, he frames himself as a product of a corrupt system. A system that rewarded chaos while punishing those who refused to play quietly. Inside the prison infirmary, surrounded by medical equipment and concrete walls, Suge Knight is no longer physically intimidating. But his voice still carries weight. His name still commands attention. And his willingness to speak now threatens to rewrite one of the most carefully managed narratives in music history. The question is no longer whether Suge Knight knows something. The question is how much he knows and how much of it he is willing to reveal. If even half of his claims are true, then the story of the 1990s hip-hop era is far darker than anyone ever admitted. It means the murders of Tupac and Biggie were not failures of justice, but examples of justice being deliberately denied. As the walls close in on Diddy and other powerful figures, Suge Knight believes the truth is finally cornered. And from a dark cell in San Diego, a blind man who once ruled the West Coast may be preparing to deliver his final confession. Not for redemption, not for sympathy, but because silence no longer serves him. This is not just the story of a fallen mogul. It is the story of an industry built on violence, protected by influence, and fueled by silence. And as Suge Knight listens to the world outside his cell begin to crack, one thing becomes clear: the secrets of the 1990s were never buried forever. They were only waiting for the moment when the people who knew them had nothing left to lose. What makes Suge Knight's potential revelations even more dangerous is the timing. For years, he spoke in fragments, hints, and half-statements, often dismissed as the ramblings of a disgraced mogul trying to rewrite history. But now, the landscape has changed. Federal pressure is mounting. Old alliances are cracking. And the same institutions that once ignored certain questions are being forced to revisit them. From Suge's perspective, this is not coincidence. It is consequence. According to people close to him, Suge Knight believes the federal government has known key details about the 1990s hip-hop war for years. He claims informants were planted deep inside the music industry, feeding information not just about artists, but about executives, street connections, and financial pipelines. These informants, Suge says, weren't there to prevent violence. They were there to monitor it, manage it, and in some cases, exploit it. The chaos of the era created leverage, and leverage created control. Suge has repeatedly hinted that certain law enforcement figures benefited from keeping cases unresolved. Unsolved murders meant no exposure of compromised investigations, no scrutiny of informant handling, and no accountability for evidence that mysteriously disappeared. In his view, the deaths of Tupac and Biggie became convenient endpoint tragedies that closed chapters. Instead of opening investigations, the public mourned. The industry moved on, and the truth stayed buried. Inside prison, Suge Knight has had years to reflect on his role in everything that happened. He acknowledges that his leadership style was aggressive, intimidating, and at times reckless. But he argues that he was never hiding behind respectability or clean images. Others, he claims, were far more dangerous because they operated quietly. While he was labeled the monster, they remained executives, philanthropists, and untouchable icons. That imbalance is something Suge has never accepted. As his health continues to decline, the urgency to speak grows stronger. Legal blindness has stripped him of distractions. He spends long hours alone, replaying memories, conversations, and moments that defined an era. According to those who have spoken to him, Suge is no longer interested in legacy or reputation. His concern now is control over his own story. He does not want history written solely by the people who survived and challenged. There is also the question of leverage. Suge Knight understands how information works. He knows that the threat of speaking can sometimes be more powerful than speaking itself. By signaling that he is ready to expose names, systems, and connections, he forces reactions. He forces denials. And he forces attention. In a world where silence once protected everyone involved, noise becomes a weapon. What terrifies many observers is not just what Suge might reveal, but what those revelations could trigger. If federal investigations begin connecting dots that were once ignored, the fallout could extend far beyond hip-hop. Record labels, law enforcement agencies, political connections, and financial networks could all come under scrutiny. The 1990s were not just a cultural moment, they were a business era, and billions of dollars flowed through unchecked systems. The story of Biggie Smalls' murder remains one of the most painful examples. Shot in Los Angeles, thousands of miles from home, Biggie was supposed to be safe. According to Suge, that safety was an illusion. He claims multiple warnings were ignored, multiple threats were downplayed, and critical security failures were never investigated properly. Whether by negligence or design, Biggie was left exposed. And once again, no one was held responsible. As Suge listens to modern headlines from his cell, he recognizes patterns he's seen before. Public denials, carefully worded statements, lawyers controlling narratives, media distractions. It all feels familiar. The only difference now is that time has weakened the shields that once protected powerful figures. Witnesses are aging, records are resurfacing, and the public is far less willing to accept official silence. Suge Knight may never walk free again. He knows this. But in his mind, freedom now means something else. It means telling the truth without fear of retaliation. It means removing himself as the convenient villain and exposing the system that thrived on chaos, while pretending to oppose it. Whether people believe him or not is secondary. What matters to him is that the story is finally complete. As the walls of his cell remain unchanged, the world outside continues to shift. And somewhere between failing eyesight and fading strength, Suge Knight believes he still holds one last piece of power, the truth. A truth that could challenge decades of accepted history, disrupt carefully protected reputations, and force a reckoning long overdue. Because if the darkest era of hip-hop taught the world anything, it's this: when money, power, and silence collide, justice is often the first casualty. And until the full truth of Tupac, Shakur, and the Notorious B.I.G. is brought into the light, the story of the 1990s will remain incomplete, a legacy built not just on music, but on secrets. For years, Suge Knight watched the world from behind bars as the hip-hop industry moved on without him. From inside a concrete cell, surrounded by steel doors and constant surveillance, he heard everything. He heard about the lawsuits. He heard about the allegations. And most importantly, he heard the name of the man he has called his enemy for decades, Sean Diddy Combs, being dragged into headlines filled with words like raids, trafficking, and federal investigations. For Suge Knight, silence was no longer an option. That moment marked the birth of something no one expected. From inside prison walls, Suge Knight launched a podcast called Collect Call. There was no studio, no professional setup, no polished production. The audio was rough, recorded through a prison phone line that crackled, cut out, and echoed off concrete walls. But the voice was unmistakable, deep, gravelly, heavy with authority and menace. This was Suge Knight speaking publicly again, and for the first time in nearly 30 years. The world leaned in, terrified of what he might reveal. Suge didn't sound shocked by the FBI raids on Diddy's mansions in Los Angeles and Miami in 2024, when federal agents kicked in doors and seized electronics, documents, and boxes of evidence. Suge's reaction was chilling. He laughed, not out of humor but out of recognition, as if this was something he always knew would happen. He picked up the phone for his podcast and delivered a message aimed directly at the man. He mockingly calls brother love. "I'll tell you what, Puffy," Suge said, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "Your life is in danger." According to Suge, this was not a threat. It was a warning. A warning about the company Diddy keeps and the world he has lived in for decades. Suge claimed that Diddy knows too many secrets that powerful people cannot afford to have exposed. He spoke about alleged secret rooms at elite parties, about freak-offs involving politicians, executives, and celebrities whose public images would not survive the truth. Suge suggested that if Diddy were ever to take the stand, the damage wouldn't stop with him. It would spread outward, taking down people far more powerful. In Suge Knight's words, Diddy has become a liability, and in the world of high-stakes crime, liabilities don't get protected, they get eliminated. Suge's warning then turned darker, more graphic, and deeply unsettling. Speaking from years of first-hand prison experience, he offered Diddy brutal advice about survival behind bars. He told him that prison is not a place for personas or public images. The brother love character Suge warned would make him a target from the moment he walked in. He described prison life in raw, unforgiving terms, telling Diddy he needed to decide right now whether he was going to stand up or squat down. When using the prison toilet, a phrase that carries terrifying implications in prison culture, Suge wasn't joking. He was telling Diddy that softness is weakness on the inside and weakness gets exploited fast. According to Suge, prison doesn't care about money, fame, or past success. It only respects strength and awareness. And he warned that Diddy's lifestyle, reputation, and alleged actions would put a target on his back from day one. But the most shocking part of Suge Knight's message wasn't about the future. It was about the past. As his voice slowed and his tone hardened, Suge began connecting dots that many people have whispered about for decades, but rarely said out loud. He implied that the violence Diddy is accused of today is not new. According to Suge, it is the same energy, the same behavior, and the same methods that existed during the deadly era of the East Coast versus West Coast War in the 1990s. He suggested that the chaos surrounding Diddy's current legal troubles mirrors the violent climate that claimed the lives of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. Suge didn't provide court evidence or legal documents, but his implication was clear. He claimed that the same darkness, now being investigated by federal authorities, existed back then, hidden behind money, fame, and influence. He suggested that what the world is seeing today is not a fall from grace, but a long-delayed exposure. To understand why Suge's words carry weight, you have to understand his history. Suge Knight was not an outsider. He was one of the most powerful figures in hip-hop during its most dangerous era. As the co-founder of Death Row Records, he stood at the center of the industry when it was fueled by ego, rivalry, and unchecked power. He knew the players, he knew the politics, and he knew how violence and intimidation operated behind the scenes. The East Coast versus West Coast War was never just about music. It was about money, control, and dominance. On one side stood Death Row Records with Suge Knight, Tupac Shakur, and Dr. Dre. On the other stood Bad Boy Records, led by Diddy, with Biggie Smalls as its crown jewel. While fans consumed diss tracks and media narratives, insiders have long claimed that executives and power brokers were pulling the strings.